They don't fear guns. They don't fear tanks. They don't fear bombs. What they fear is the truth spoken by a free black mind. See, the moment a black man starts thinking for himself, not just thinking, but speaking, that's when he becomes dangerous. That's when he becomes a target. That's when he's labeled a threat, a radical, an extremist, a menace to society. But what kind of society calls truth a threat? What kind of system trembles at a man who dares to open his mouth and say, "We are not free"? They'll allow you to dance. They'll let you sing. They'll let you act a fool on television. But the minute you speak with conviction, the minute you speak with power, the minute you speak with purpose, the crosshairs find your forehead. You see, this system was never built for our liberation. It was built on our backs, off our labor, with our blood. But we've been told to be grateful, grateful for crumbs, grateful for hand-me-down justice, grateful for slow progress. Let me tell you something. Progress is not justice. A dog that's chained can still be fed, but that dog ain't free. They want you to believe you've come a long way. They show you a black face in a high place and call it change. But representation without revolution is just decoration. A black face in the White House doesn't mean black people in the ghetto eat better. Doesn't mean our kids stop dying in the streets. Doesn't mean the schools stop failing or the police stop killing. We are still dying. Still begging for the same rights they promised in their so-called Constitution. Still asking not to be lynched, now by rope, but by badge. Still asking for humanity in a land that only values us when we shut up, suit up, and sell out. Let me say it plain. They don't want the black man to be free. They want him to be silent. They want him to be obedient. They want him to be grateful for survival while they thrive on his silence. But I will not be silent. I refuse to be silent. Because silence in the face of injustice is betrayal. They want you to believe the problem is within you. That the reason you're poor is because you don't work hard enough. That the reason you're jailed is because you're naturally violent. That the reason you're shot is because you wore the wrong thing, said the wrong thing, breathed the wrong way. But let me tell you the truth. The problem is not you. The problem is the system that profits off your misery, that criminalizes your existence, that fears your awakening. And the greatest threat to that system is a black man who knows who he is. A black woman who knows her worth. A people who remember where they come from and demand what is rightfully theirs. Not in whispers, not in polite petitions, but in thunder that shakes the walls of power. They didn't kill him for nothing. They didn't kill him because he was wrong. They killed him because he was right. Because his words lit fires in the minds of the oppressed. Because he didn't just preach peace, he preached justice. And justice requires truth. And truth, my brothers and sisters, is more dangerous than any weapon. They don't fear the weapons. They don't fear the protests. They don't fear the marches. What they fear is the truth. Raw, unfiltered, unapologetic truth. Coming from the lips of a black mind that refuses to be owned, controlled, or manipulated. That is what sends tremors through the pillars of power. A free black mind, not enslaved by their education, not indoctrinated by their media, not pacified by their promises. That's what keeps them awake at night. Because when a black man or woman begins to think independently, when they begin to question the system that has tried to crush them from birth, when they begin to connect the dots between their history and their present reality, the illusion begins to crumble. The mask of democracy slips and the ugly face of oppression reveals itself. They have always been afraid of that kind of mind. That kind of mind that doesn't just memorize facts fed to it, but analyzes those facts, challenges those facts, exposes the contradictions in those facts. That kind of mind that recognizes that history did not begin in chains, that before we were slaves, we were kings, builders, astronomers, warriors, scholars. That kind of mind that knows slavery didn't end. It evolved, it changed its name, changed its uniform, changed its strategy, but never changed its objective to keep us mentally and economically chained, to make sure we stay in our place, to keep us divided, distracted, and disarmed. A free black mind sees through the game. It sees that the ghetto wasn't an accident, that mass incarceration wasn't a glitch in the system, that underfunded schools and overfunded police weren't just bad policy. They were intentional. That the system isn't broken. It's functioning exactly as it was designed to. And when that realization takes root, when that awareness becomes common knowledge, that's when the system begins to panic. That's when they send in the agents, the infiltrators, the manipulators to confuse the movement, to co-opt the language, to dilute the message. That's when they label you dangerous, when they put you on watch lists, when they threaten your livelihood, when they try to bury your voice. Because they understand that once you awaken a man's mind, you can't unawake it. Once he sees the truth, he can't unsee it. Once he knows he's been lied to, manipulated, and misled, he no longer asks for permission, he demands power. He no longer begs for acceptance. He organizes for liberation. He no longer seeks to fit into a burning house, he builds his own. And they know that a single free, thinking individual can spark a wildfire of consciousness that a single voice, unshackled and unbought, can turn passive listeners into active revolutionaries. That is what they fear, not just the message, but the ripple effect of that message. They've built empires off our ignorance, off our silence, off our belief in their myths, off our participation in our own destruction. But once the mind is free, the lies collapse. The distractions no longer work. The pacifiers lose their flavor. The handouts are rejected. The propaganda is exposed. And when enough minds reach that state of clarity, of awareness, of power, that is when the balance shifts. That is when the oppressed become the organizers. That is when the hunted become the hunters. That is when the victims become the visionaries. And so, the system does everything in its power to stop that transformation. They flood the airwaves with noise. They push poison through the culture. They glorify ignorance and mock intellect. They reward betrayal and punish loyalty to the truth. They turn education into indoctrination. They turn politics into theater. They make sure you're too busy surviving to start thinking. They want you afraid. They want you numb. They want you believing that nothing can change, that the most you can hope for is survival under their rule. But the free mind rejects that lie. The free mind knows that survival is not enough, that dignity is non-negotiable, that freedom is not a gift. It's a birthright. The truth spoken by a free black mind has the power to shake nations, to disrupt centuries of control, to dismantle systems of exploitation. That truth is not just information, it's a weapon. It pierces through propaganda, it cuts through the lies, it ignites fires in those who've been left cold and voiceless for too long. And the system knows this. That's why they assassinate the ones who speak it. Not because they're violent, not because they're wrong, but because they're effective. Because their words reach the ears of the oppressed and give them courage. Because their truths plant seeds that bloom into revolution. Because once a free mind begins to speak, others begin to listen, others begin to question, others begin to rise. This is why censorship exists. This is why surveillance exists. This is why character assassination precedes physical assassination. Because they know the truth is contagious. And once it's out, it spreads beyond their control. It jumps fences, crosses borders, and breaks barriers. It wakes up the youth. It inspires the broken. It organizes the scattered. It threatens their order. And it empowers the very people they have worked so hard to keep powerless. A mind that is free is not just a threat to the system. It is the end of that system as they know it. Because when the truth is no longer feared, when it is no longer hidden, when it is no longer whispered in the dark but shouted from every corner, there is nothing left to hold on to except justice, accountability, and change. Representation without revolution is just decoration. They will put a black face on the television, give it a suit and a title, and call it progress. They will showcase that face at the head of a boardroom, on a magazine cover, in political office, and tell the world, look how far we've come. But if that face has no power to change the condition of the people it resembles, if that face is simply there to create the illusion of inclusion, then that face is nothing more than a mask to disguise the unchanged reality beneath it. They will elevate a few to pacify the many. They will reward those who don't challenge the system with visibility and access, while those who speak the truth are buried, blocked, and silenced. And they will say, we gave you representation, as if presence alone is power, as if having a seat at the table means you built the house, as if being allowed to speak means they are listening. But what good is representation when the prisons are still full of our brothers? When our sisters are still dying in childbirth at rates that scream neglect and systemic racism? What good is it when the schools in our neighborhoods are still falling apart, still underfunded, still unable to prepare our children for the future? What good is it when police still patrol our streets like an occupying force, when justice is still a privilege of the wealthy and the white? What good is it when the very laws that oppress us are voted on by people who look like us but think like them? When those chosen to represent us have been trained, tamed, and tailored to fit the same mold as those who built this corrupt structure in the first place? Representation without revolution is how they keep us quiet while keeping us in chains. It is how they sell us symbols instead of substance. They give us first the first black this, the first woman that, the first gay this, and then they ask for applause. But what happens after the first? What happens when the history books are updated but the present remains unchanged? What happens when the photo ops are over and the cameras stop rolling and the people are still hungry, still homeless, still hunted? If a symbol does not lead to structural change, it becomes a distraction. And distractions are dangerous when they are used to cover the tracks of injustice. This is not about hating the ones who rise. It is not about denying the brilliance or the worth of individuals who break barriers. It is about refusing to be satisfied with surface level change. Because true progress is not measured by how many of us sit in high places. It's measured by how many of us no longer live in the lowest. It's measured by how many of us are fed, educated, housed, protected, and empowered. It's measured not by who the system allows in, but by how the system treats the masses. And if those masses are still struggling, still suffering, still stuck in the same cycles, then that representation has not served them. It has served the system. They use representation as a shield against accountability. When we speak out against oppression, they say, "But look who's in charge now," as if the presence of someone who looks like us means the system no longer works against us. As if racism retires when a black face appears behind a podium. As if economic injustice disappears when a few of us become billionaires. But the truth is, a black face at the top of a system built on white supremacy does not dismantle that system. It validates it. It allows them to say, "See, it works," while it continues to grind up lives and hopes at the bottom. It gives the appearance of equity while maintaining the same old hierarchies. It's not justice. It's camouflage. Revolution is not just protests in the streets or slogans on signs. Revolution is a change in power. Revolution is dismantling the structures that oppress and replacing them with ones that liberate. Revolution is when representation is backed by action, when those who look like us are not just placed in seats of power, but use that power to transform conditions. Revolution is when policies change, when laws are rewritten, when budgets are redirected, when police are held accountable, when schools are fully funded, when healthcare is a right, when housing is no longer a privilege, when every life matters not just in speech but in systems. And without that revolution, representation becomes spectacle. It becomes theater. It becomes a mask that hides the unchanged reality from the world. And from ourselves, they will keep handing us mirrors and asking us to celebrate. Look, they say, "You're in the picture now." But being in the picture is not the same as holding the camera. Being at the table is not the same as owning the land. We need more than a place in their game. We need a new game entirely. We need representation that confronts, not conforms. That challenges, not comforts. That builds, not just belongs. We need leaders who speak truth to power, not smile in its shadow. We need voices that echo the cries of the people, not the agenda of the powerful. When representation becomes the goal instead of the tool, we lose sight of the purpose. The purpose is freedom. The purpose is justice. The purpose is dignity. And if representation does not bring us closer to that purpose, then it has failed. Not because of who it is, but because of what it is. A symbol without substance, a presence without power, a performance without purpose. The revolution cannot be televised if it is only cosmetic. It cannot be sold in campaign speeches and branding strategies. It must be lived, it must be fought for, and it must be built from the ground up by the people, for the people. The system fears a people who know their worth and demand justice. Not a people who simply want to survive, not a people who hope for charity, but a people who know they are owed and are no longer asking politely. When people know their worth, they become ungovernable by lies, immune to manipulation, and unwilling to accept crumbs from the table of power. They no longer believe that freedom is something to be earned by good behavior, or that justice is granted as a reward for silence. They know that freedom is theirs by birthright and justice is theirs by truth. And the moment they begin to act on that knowledge, the system begins to panic. Because a people who know their worth don't sit quietly in the back, don't wait for permission, don't tolerate being stepped on, silenced, or sold out. They rise, they resist, they refuse. The system thrives on amnesia. It depends on a people forgetting who they are, where they come from, what they've built, and what they've endured. It depends on erasing the memory of resistance and replacing it with the narrative of obedience. It paints the past in shadows and the future in fear, hoping to keep people frozen in the now, in a state of dependence and confusion. But when people remember, when they awaken to the truth that their ancestors were not passive victims but powerful survivors, revolutionaries, kings, queens, warriors, healers, and builders, when they understand the legacy they carry in their blood and the strength they inherit from generations who refuse to bow, that is when the system starts to break. Because a people who know their worth cannot be pacified with symbolism. They cannot be bought with representation, distracted with entertainment, or silenced with slogans. They see through the smokescreen. They see that promises mean nothing without power, that laws mean nothing without enforcement, and that peace means nothing without justice. They stop chasing inclusion and start demanding transformation. They stop asking to be heard and start building their own platforms. They stop seeking validation from those who never saw them as human in the first place. The system is terrified of that transformation, of a population no longer willing to compromise with its own oppression. That is why education is controlled. That is why truth is hidden. That is why the history books lie, the media distorts, the curriculum excludes, and the institutions misinform. Because knowledge breeds confidence. Confidence breeds courage, and courage breeds action. The moment people learn the depth of their power, the system starts to lose control. It loses its grip when they realize that unity is more powerful than money, That collective voice is stronger than state violence, and that dignity cannot be legislated. It must be seized. They don't mind a population that knows how to consume. They don't mind people who know how to spend, how to entertain, how to survive. But they do mind people who think, who organize, who speak truth, who fight back. They do mind when workers realize they have power in their labor, when students realize they have power in their minds, when communities realize they have power in their numbers, when mothers and fathers realize they have power in protecting their children not just from the streets, but from the very system that profits from those streets. They mind when churches preach liberation instead of comfort, when artists speak revolution instead of compliance, when youth see themselves as builders instead of followers. And so the system works overtime to keep the people distracted, divided, and discouraged. It tells them they are powerless. It tells them nothing will change. It tells them fighting back is pointless. It shows them examples of failure and buries examples of victory. It funds confusion and starves clarity. It rewards betrayal and punishes loyalty to the cause. It convinces them that their pain is their fault, that poverty is a result of laziness, that injustice is just a glitch in an otherwise fair society. It individualizes every problem and pathologizes every protest. But once people understand that their suffering is not isolated but systemic, that it is not their fault but a feature of the machine, they stop internalizing blame and start externalizing resistance. They stop tearing each other down and start building each other up. They stop looking up for saviors and start looking across for allies. This is what the system fears. A people who stop asking and start acting. A people who build their own schools when theirs are failing. Who feed their own when the state refuses. Who protect their own when the law betrays them. Who create their own media, their own businesses, their own political strategies. Who don't wait for the powerful to give them justice, but take it with the force of unity and purpose. A people who recognize that change does not come from above, but from below, from the ground, from the roots, from the struggle, from the streets. They fear a people who no longer accept suffering as normal, who no longer explain away oppression, who no longer justify injustice. They fear a people who reject the politics of respectability and the illusion of neutrality, who know that neutrality in the face of injustice is not peace, it is participation. They fear those who teach the next generation not to conform, but to confront, not to bow, but to build, not to assimilate, but to liberate. They fear that one spark, one voice, one thought, one act can ignite a movement that spreads from one household to another, one block to another, one city to another, until the very foundation of oppression begins to shake. They can kill the man, but not the mission. They can assassinate the body, but they cannot erase the ideas that lived in his voice, the vision that breathed through his words, or the truth that burned in his eyes. Because when a man becomes more than flesh, when he becomes a vessel for the struggle of his people, a mouthpiece for their pain and their power, then his death is not an end. It is a beginning. The system has always believed that by silencing the speaker, they could silence the speech. But they have never understood that truth, once spoken, takes root in the hearts of the people. It multiplies. It spreads. It survives the bullet, survives the smear campaign, survives the decades. They can kill the messenger, but the message echoes louder than ever before. The mission lives on in the minds of those who heard and believed. It lives in the boy who reads a banned book and starts asking questions. It lives in the girl who watches her people struggle and decides to stand, to speak, to organize. It lives in every mother who teaches her child the difference between obedience and dignity, between submission and strength. It lives in every brother and sister who refuses to forget, who keeps the fire alive not by memory alone, but by action, by sacrifice, by commitment. Because a true mission doesn't end in martyrdom, it begins there. The death of the leader is the planting of a seed. That seed may be buried in grief, watered in pain, but it grows because the people refuse to let it die. The system counts on fear. It counts on shock. It hopes the death will traumatize the people into silence, paralyze them into submission. But it forgets that grief can turn into fuel, that mourning can turn into marching, that heartbreak can turn into rebellion. The very act meant to destroy the movement often becomes the catalyst that strengthens it. The man may be gone, but the reasons he fought are still here. The conditions he challenged still persist. The injustice he exposed still thrives. And as long as those things exist, the mission cannot die. It cannot be buried. It cannot be silenced. They try to reduce him to a quote. They try to package him into a statue. They try to paint him in the safest light possible, strip him of his fire, sanitize his message, make him acceptable to the very institutions he stood against. But the mission resists that. The mission is not safe. It is not soft. It is not easy to digest. The mission is confrontation. It is accountability. The mission says the oppressor must be challenged, not comforted. The mission says the people must rise, not wait. The mission says justice is not granted. It is taken, seized, demanded, forced if necessary. And no matter how they try to rewrite history, the real ones remember. The ones who carry the mission in their spirit, in their bones, they remember what he stood for. They remember what he died for, and they pick up where he left off. The mission can move from voice to voice, from city to city, from generation to generation. It doesn't need permission. It doesn't need a platform. It moves underground if it has to. It spreads in whispers if it must. It travels in songs, in poetry, in pain, in protest. It speaks through murals, through classrooms, through the defiant cry of a mother, through the clenched fist of a student, through the determined walk of a man who knows his rights and refuses to bow. It speaks in courtrooms and in corner stores, in churches and in prisons, in rallies and in whispers passed from elder to child. The mission is carried by the people who refuse to accept things as they are, who refuse to let fear win, who refuse to be lied to, pacified, or controlled. They think they can win by ending a life. But lives are not the mission. Lives are the vessels. The mission is larger. The mission is liberation. The mission is justice. The mission is truth. The mission is dignity. And these things don't die with men. They live through struggle, through sacrifice, through blood, through time. The mission lives in every voice that speaks when silence is demanded. It lives in every step taken toward justice. It lives in every act of defiance, no matter how small. The mission is not one man's dream. It is the collective will of a people who've had enough, a people who will not be broken, a people who know that no bullet, no prison, no smear campaign can stop a truth whose time has come. Even when they try to bury him in shame, distort his image, twist his words, the people will always remember who he really was. Not the version printed in textbooks or softened for school children, but the version who spoke with fire, who challenged the powerful, who stood with the broken and the angry and the lost. The one who told us we were more than what they made us. The one who told us to stand tall, to know ourselves, to fight if we had to. That version can't be erased. That version lives in the mission. That mission is not dead. It is not over. It is not finished. Because every time injustice shows its face, the mission answers. Every time the system strikes down one, 10 more rise up. Every time they think they've won, the streets prove otherwise. The mission is still breathing. It is still moving. It is still rising, not in marble monuments, but in the rage of the oppressed, not in official holidays, but in the hunger for truth. Not in slogans printed on shirts, but in lives transformed by resistance. The man may be gone, but the fire he lit still burns. It burns in the hearts of the bold, the fearless, the awake. And as long as it burns, the mission continues.